everyone, and welcome to Power of Kindness, a TAL radio show powered by Touch Life Foundation. I am your host, Allie, and today I am joined by a very special guest. Surya Tejamandati is a senior at Fremont High School and a member of the Bay Area TAL Scouts. Teja, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me onto the podcast, and thank you for giving me this opportunity today. Excited to see what we can get into.
So just to, before we get into it, because we're going to talk about an interview that you conducted in a little bit. But first, I wanted to introduce some of our listeners to the TAL Scout program. Can you give us some introduction? What are the TAL Scouts all about?
Yeah, of course. So, just a bit about myself is my name is Surya Tejamandati. I go to Irvington High School, and I'm in Fremont, California, and joined the Tall Scouts basically at its starting, I believe last July. So, we started the original Touch of Life Scouts team here in the Bay Area, and basically our main function back then was mainly to work with marketing efforts and sort of learn about the power of kindness and a lot of the efforts that Touch of Life was able to do. So some initial stuff we did was we did a lot of research with schools, and we did a lot of research with counties. We worked a lot with the Tall Giving platform that Touch of Life has, and really how it works and how we onboard people onto our platform and sort of garner funding and donations for these requests we have on our platform. So we did a bit of work with that, and overall, it was a great experience over summer, and we've also did a few more efforts into the school year as well. But it's definitely been an amazing experience to work with industry professionals here at Touch of Life. Give back to my community through the Tall Giving platform, and really learn about a lot of the inequities and sort of problems within our society and how we can sort of address them.
You mentioned that kind of research you did initially and looking into the needs of your community. Can you tell us a little bit about that first project and what are some of the things that you learned?
Yeah, so basically, our first project was we split the Bay Area up into the 5 counties or so. I believe it was Contra Costa, San Francisco, Santa Clara, um, and a few other counties that we had that I can't seem to get. I believe Alameda was another one as well. And so basically, each member of our Tall Scout group of the Bay Area team, we did some research on the schools within each of these counties. So for me, myself, I focused on Contra Costa County. So I did a lot of research on cities in the county that didn't have the best socioeconomic conditions, and then schools within these counties and further organizations and how we can help them. So I found a lot of research into how there's sort of pockets of inequality within each of these counties. Contra Costa County as a whole is not as it's pretty well off its average socioeconomic wise. However, there's certain cities within the county, such as Richmond or Antioch, that are not as well off as others. And then you can also see that within the schools in these areas. So just sort of looking into those factors and looking at the income maps and other factors that affect how these counties are made up really showed me a lot about how inequality is built within our own counties, and how we can further help in areas that we can help out through Touch of Life. Yeah.
That's great. And raising that awareness, was it a surprise to you at all to realize that this was happening kind of in your backyard?
Yeah, so I think that's the biggest part of it, that it was happening in our backyard. I think we always hear about inequality. We always hear about these issues happening across the country and across the world. But to see it actually happening within your own community, within like cities that are close to you, in areas that you have visited, it really shows you that firsthand account, which raises a lot of awareness and is a true surprise in a lot of this research.
Yeah, absolutely. On that note, I'd love to segue into your interview with an individual who's kind of experiencing this firsthand and working with students. We had the pleasure of sitting down to talk to Dr. Sean Powell, the Director of Student Services at Eastside Union High School District in San Jose, California. Now, to give some context, last December, Touch Life Foundation partnered with Eastside to support their McKinneyVento holiday program, which served about 300 homeless students and their families. And by utilizing the Tao Giving mobile app, which Tasia mentioned earlier, Eastside raised just over $8,000 for these students. So Tasia spoke to Dr. Powell to learn more about the McKinneyVento program, the challenges facing students in Eastside Union High School District, and the various ways that people and organizations can help support the causes. Anything you'd like to add, Tasia, before we play that interview?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of great information about the McKinney-Vento program, and as well as how we as Touch of Life came in and helped. So definitely a good podcast to hear, and from my end was definitely a good opportunity to learn about the student services and McKinney-Vento programs at a lot of the school districts local to my community.
Thank you so much. And with that, here's that interview.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Sean Powell. I'm the Director of Student Services in Eastside Union High School District. This is actually my first year in the role. I am a social worker by training, worked in child welfare for a little bit of time, nonprofit work a little bit. Noticed that, in my work with young people in those spaces, they all went to school. And so I was like, well, how can I work with all of them? And so I decided to jump into school social work, became a school social worker. And then I realized, man, we need some better systems to support our most vulnerable populations. I've worked with many of them in these other spaces. So let me become a school administrator. And so I became a dean of students at a middle school, worked my way into district leadership, and have been there ever since.
Great, thank you for that. So would you like to give us a brief background on how the McKinney-Vento program operates at ESU HSD?
Yeah, so McKinney-Vento is actually a nationwide program. McKinney-Vento comes from the McKinney-Vento Act. And so the act is one that supports all students that are experiencing homelessness, but we define homelessness broadly. So it could be that the student is unsheltered and their family is unsheltered, or maybe they live in a home with multiple other families. And in those various cases, they would still be able to qualify for McKinney-Vento. And so the way that our program works is that families who are experiencing homelessness, they are able to submit a form. And once that form is submitted, it allows us as a school district to provide a number of things. We can provide clothing to families. We can provide transportation via bus passes or other forms of public transportation. We can support them with academics in terms of graduation. Because there's so much mobility, sometimes they don't necessarily have the same opportunities to access school as other students would. So we're able to provide academic supports. In our district, we provide one-to-one tutoring as well as group tutoring for our students who are McKinney-Vento, and we provide case management. So we will travel with them from school to school within our district because they may move around a lot. We want to make sure that, one, they have an opportunity to stay at the same school so that they can foster relationships, even if their outside circumstances change. But two, if they do need to shift schools within our district, that they have a case manager that will go with them. So that's really the overview of how our program works. We also have a really huge event, which is our McKinney-Vento Christmas event, where we bring the McKinney-Vento families across our district. That's 200 plus families. And we do a huge meal all together, eating and providing resources for community-based agencies to them. And so that is what our McKinney-Vento program looks like in the East Side.
Just to jump in, that holiday program was our first introduction to the McKinney-Vento program, because we worked with you guys over this past year with it being 2020 and not being able to have that in-person event, it was a great opportunity for us to showcase our support by utilizing the Tau Giving platform to raise funds through a digital means. So then I know you guys helped almost 300 homeless students and their families with that program this year. It was really an amazing opportunity for us to contribute.
No, we were super excited. We were able to expand our offerings to our students and families significantly. We were able to not only provide food, clothing, socks, we were able to give gift cards to families this year so that they could have food throughout the kind of winter break for 2 weeks of time. And so, the partnership, we were just able to connect with and provide a much higher level of access to things that our students and our families, particularly who are McKinneyVento, struggle with during the break, because most of our McKinneyVento students, they get free lunch from school because they're McKinneyVento. And so when school is not in session, that opportunity doesn't always exist. And so it was a need that we were able to meet.
Absolutely.
Great. It's good to make that connection, and we're glad to have helped this past winter. And you talked a lot about how a lot of these students may not have the same sort of opportunities to education, especially because they have to move around a lot. There's a ton of other circumstances within their own lives. Could you go into detail, like what are some of the challenges these students face who are involved in the McKinneyVento program on a sort of day-to-day basis? Are there any alarming disparities in terms of graduation rates or mental health risk that we see when we compare the McKinneyVento students to the general student population?
Absolutely. So I'll start with the disparities and disproportionality, not only in the East Side, but really across the state and across the country. When we look at the data for our students that are McKinneyVento, their graduation rates are lower, mental health is higher, attendance is lower as well. So looking at those kind of three major buckets of mental health, attendance, and graduation rates are a huge, huge concern for us, because we know that there's many variables that are happening for our students. When we think about being able to excel academically, we think about, are the most basic needs of a person met? Do they have food? Do they have shelter? Do they have access to electricity? Do they have water? Right? And it becomes really challenging to think about, like, oh, let me do my homework, right? Let me, spend my 5 hours, just doing homework when I don't know where I'm going to lay my head at night. Or for our students that do know where they're going to lay their head, and maybe they are what is considered doubled up. So they are living in a residence with other families, which is very common here in the East Side, just because of cost of living is so high. So we have a lot of families that will double up and they'll get one place, two different families. Is, well, how do you engage in your schoolwork when there are 8 other people in the house and all of this noise is surrounding you, right? And so and you don't have your own room to go and work, or maybe not even access to your own computer to work on. These are very real experiences for the students that we serve within our McKinneyVento program. And those are just some of the basic challenges that they face. In addition to that, when you think about our students who are in McKinneyVento, because their residencies can be so unstable, there's a lot of transition and moving from one place to another place. And what that tends to impact is attendance rates, as well as consistently being in the same school. So for many folks, they're able to start high school in one school and stay there for 4 years. And when you're moving around, some of our students are not moving within the same district or the same city. We have students that are attending, but they live temporarily in Gilroy in shelter, right? So being able to navigate that and having to take transportation impacts attendance, right? And so we do our very best to provide opportunities for our young people to stay in the same school so that they can keep the relationships with their peers. But sometimes there's other challenges that impact that, right? So you're weighing the logistics of how far is this school from where you are with mental health and social connections. And that's what many of our students are and their families are having to deal with.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's one of the reasons I kind of got involved with Touch a Life is I read a lot how a lot of these school mobility causes a loss in social capital for a lot of these kids, as they don't have the same access to teachers, other students or friends, which would have helped them in their other schools. So a lot of the things, that I and a lot of my other friends that we take for granted are definitely things that these students have to worry about on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And so I think COVID-19 has obviously had a lot of impact for students in regards to access and learning at home in regard versus learning inside of a classroom. Has COVID-19 had any impacts on how the McKinneyVento program operates and the students involved within it?
Yes, so COVID-19 has had impacts on everybody, but in specific for our McKinneyVento youth, most of our students are at home on their computer working on distance learning. And for our McKinneyVento students, they may not necessarily have a home to be at. And so we have had to make adjustments. And so in our district, we actually provide a computer as well as opportunities for our McKinneyVento youth to come to school to engage in distance learning. So even though they're in distance learning, they can come to school in order to have access to the internet, in order to get food, in order to clean up or be able to, change clothes or things like that, if depending on what their situation is in terms of living. So that's been one of the hugest shifts that we've had to make in our program. In addition to that, our parent and community involvement specialists have been doing a lot of work to try to connect families to shelters, so that our families who are McKinneyVento and who did not have even short-term temporary housing could access that. And so I can think of students and families that we've been able to support throughout this pandemic. And I'll just add that for us in Eastside San Jose, while we were in the pandemic, we also had a period of fires in our community, that we had people that did have residences, but because of the fires, their homes were impacted. And so they were displaced and they became McKinneyVento while we were in the middle of the pandemic. And so for us, this program is so important and so impactful. And it makes a huge difference for the students and the families in our community to be able to have access to resources through the schools.
Yeah, that's interesting. I completely forgot about how the forest fires played into this overall situation as well with everything else that's going on. But so as the director of the Student Services Program, what are some goals you have for the McKinneyVento program across the district? As you said, this was your first year. So is there any goals that you came with or anything you really wanted to achieve in this role?
Yeah, so some of my goals, number one, is that Eastside Union is located in San Jose. And San Jose, I know y'all may have seen the maps of like the most expensive places you can live. And San Jose is one of them. And so I actually think we are probably underreporting the number of McKinneyVento families that we service. And so one of my primary goals is, how do we expand access? What can we put in place to make sure that we really are connecting with our students and our families, and that they feel safe disclosing what their living situation is, so that we can give access to these services? Because I think there's many families that we aren't yet servicing that we could be. So that's one of my primary goals. And especially in this year with COVID-19 and the pandemic, that was so important for us. My second primary goal is that I want to ensure that we are able to provide a high and rigorous level of educational coaching for our students, because this is high school, right? And we want our students, whether you're a McKinneyVento or not, to be able to graduate college and career ready. And so what does that look like when there are variables in play that are really outside of the school, right, with housing and things like that? And so by providing ongoing educational coaching and a high level of monitoring of where our students are in terms of their credits, and having monthly meetings to be able to do that, and to facilitate that with our social workers as well as our community partners that we work with. So we work with you all, but we also work with an organization called Bill Wilson to provide more of the social emotional supports and coaching to students as well. And so we want to make sure that we're able to expand that. And I would say my third goal is really to expand our partnerships with community-based agencies, right? Because we recognize that we're able to do a lot in the sense of providing, options for transportation and providing food, but that doesn't necessarily address the root cause of having shelter. And so by partnering with our community-based agencies to ensure that when our families come to us, we can get them into temporary shelters or transitional housing quickly is a huge goal that I have as a director, and one that we've already started having conversations about in collaboration with some of the community-based organizations within our local area.
Yeah, so you mentioned, I think two things that I caught were the first thing was about like the underreporting of a lot of the McKinney-Vento students and also working with these community-based agencies. So I'm assuming this has to do a bit with the legislation, sort of how the government involvement in a lot of these programs. So is there anything that can be done at the state or federal level in terms of legislation or funding that would help improve the McKinney-Vento program in many districts like Eastside Union?
Yeah, so currently at the federal level, there are specific funds that are provided to increase the supports that you are able to provide to McKinney-Vento youth. I think there needs to be an expansion of what those funds can be used for, right? So in terms of clothing and being able to provide families actual gift cards or some form of voucher, as opposed to kind of the structures or means that we have in place to be able to get those services to families is really restricted right now. And so when I have a young person that comes in and needs clothing, I want to be able to get them clothing right now and not have to go through a whole process to then get back to them to get them clothing, right? Or even a bed, right? Things like that. I think if we can remove some of the barriers so that we can get the services to the families quicker, that would be really beneficial. The other thing that I think is really critical is that as we think about the supports, where does actual housing and shelter come into that conversation, right? And that goes back to the conversation that I was sharing around working with community-based agencies to provide more opportunities to get our young people and their families into transitional housing. But I think if that was subsidized or partially funded through the federal or state government, that would also help to be able to increase that access for our families. And then the last one that I would say is around on-campus support and being able to hire specialized child welfare and attendance types of counselors or social workers who have a focus or a specialty in providing supports to this particular demographic of students would be really helpful, because there are unique needs and stories that our young people come with, and they need an ongoing advocate with them.
Yeah, and so of course, with any sort of government program or legislation, there will always be sort of gaps in enforcement or the amount of resources allocated. So how can organizations similar to Touch a Lot for other nonprofits, like I believe the Bill Wilson organization that you mentioned previously before, how can organizations like this and nonprofits sort of fill this gap and help you achieve the 3 goals that you initially stated?
Yeah, well, I think one is funding, right? When you have funding, that definitely helps. And that's where Touch a Life helped us, was to connect with other people in the community who were willing to participate in providing funding for us to be able to expand access to some of the services that we provide to our students and our families. So that's one thing that I think could help with those 3 goals. And in terms of, other types of community-based organizations, schools are really the center points of communities, because kids are required to be in school. So it's the place where you can reach the student. It's the place where you can reach parents. And so the more that community-based organizations build relationships with schools and think about how do we set up systems that are able to run through schools to get services to families, the easier that it will be, as opposed to a lot of times trying to find them out through the community through other means. It would allow us to streamline the process if schools and community-based organizations had strong collaborative partnerships with whatever the resources are that they provide. So whether that's they actually are like Bill Wilson that helps with shelter for McKinneyVento families, or maybe you're a community-based organization that supports mental health, right? Either way, all of the students and families that may need access to those many times are connected to schools in some way.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think we sort of briefly went into this about how Touch Life recently ran a fundraising campaign for Eastside Union's McKinneyVento program. Would you be able to once again go over how this specific fundraising campaign was able to bridge Eastside Union towards the overall goals for the McKinneyVento program?
Yeah, this fundraising campaign was huge. I think if I remember correctly, we were able to raise over $8,000 through this campaign. And historically, we've been able to serve around 200 families through our holiday event. And this year we were able to provide supports to over 300 families because we had the extension of funds through our partnership with you all. And so that was one way that we were really supported. But even for folks that weren't able to contribute financially who read about it, we had agencies and individuals who reached out to provide flyers about their businesses or their agencies and what kind of services that they provide, which is also important. And then I think the other way that it helps is that there's a lot of stigma that comes with or toward and stereotypes that people have when working with young people and their families that may be experiencing some form of homelessness. And so it was also an opportunity to bring awareness about the issue of homelessness and folks who are unsheltered in our communities. And so that awareness is also a really huge deal as well.
Yeah, and going off that topic of awareness, I know for myself, just understanding that there was like wealth disparities within my community, and there were bubbles where extremely concentrated area across San Jose itself, where there's extremely centralized pockets of wealth, and then you have other poorer areas and lower income areas that are often neglected. So going on this concept of awareness, what role can us individuals play in raising awareness or even further volunteering to help the lives of students involved within the McKinneyVento program? What can we as citizens do to help better this program?
Yeah, I think in terms of things that we can do, one is to really be empathetic and educate ourselves on the variables and factors that lead to homelessness or folks being unsheltered or even doubled up for that matter, because a lot of it is grounded in our systemic practices, right? I think when we don't personally experience certain situations, we don't necessarily always have that empathy as to why folks might be experiencing it, or we think that it's their fault or their responsibility, and that's not necessarily true. Many of us contribute to it unintentionally just by our involvement in the systems that surround us, right? And so I think as individuals, educating ourselves, bringing an empathetic lens, and also checking our own biases is like basic things that each and every one of us can do. In addition to that, I think sharing our resources, if we do have additional resources, is so important in the work that we do, whether that's financial resources or time resources, right? Or even expressing that through our own social capital and being willing to have dialogues with other people are things that each and every one of us can do as individuals to help combat this. And then in addition to that, voting, right? Voting on the various policies that we've been seeing that have to do with housing and raising rent and things like that can be so impactful for our families as well as job security. Right, the root causes that lead to homelessness are what really we as individuals can all support and addressing.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to Touch a Life's main goal. We're really trying to raise awareness and sort of help make that shared resources more equitable through our telegiving platform. But I sort of wanted to end on a more positive note as we come to a close. Do you have any specific experiences or anecdotes of individuals who are positively impacted through the McKinneyVento program?
Sure, absolutely. I'll give you two. This year, I remember getting a call from one of our social workers for a young man at one of our school sites who was living in a situation where the family was doubled up. So they were living in a residence with another family. And it was the young man and his mother. And the young man, he had a bed, but his mother didn't. And so he gave up his bed so that his mother could have an actual bed to sleep on. And so he was sleeping on the floor. And so through our program and our partnership, we were able to reach out to some of our community-based organizations to actually secure a bed for this young man so that he could have a bed on to do his distance learning from. So that's one story that I can recall. And one other story that I think is a really powerful story is through the work of one of our parents and community involvement specialists in our district. We actually had a family that was actually unsheltered. And so they were living on the streets. And they came to us and expressed that to us, and our parent and community involvement specialist was able to work with the shelter network in our community to actually get the family into shelter. And the transitional housing that we were able to get them to was in Gilroy. And so the positive is that we were able to get them into the housing. But I think what was so amazing about the program is that not only did our parents and community involvement specialists get them into the transitional housing, but they also personally drove a hotspot and Chromebook to the family in Gilroy so that the young people in that family could participate in distance learning. And so those are just two examples of the work and the commitment of our team to our young people and our families that are experiencing homelessness through our McKinneyVento program.
Great, thank you for sharing that. I think, sharing these stories are really important in raising awareness as they allow us to really get like a sort of characterized look behind the stats and the numbers we hear about homelessness, and actually hearing those actual stories really brings out that empathetic lens that you were talking about earlier. But other than that, that sort of wraps up all the questions that I had. I wanted to ask if you had any questions for Ollie and I before we sort of end off this interview.
No, I guess my one question would be, why do you do this work? What made you choose this topic?
Yeah, I think earlier in the summer I did some research on school districts across Bay Area, and I think I was really looking at the Contra Costa School District, and it was really crazy how we could see across Contra Costa you have, the county itself is relatively median average compared to the whole of California. They have they're relatively well off, but if you look in these select cities in states like Antioch, Richmond, Concord, you can see how the poverty is not necessarily equally spread out, but is concentrated in these sort of pockets. And you also see how a lot of these communities have been, they're often made up by minorities who have been victims of a lot of the systems that you were talking about within this interview. And a lot of these schools don't have those resources as well. So really doing the research on my own and seeing it within my own community, because you always hear, across the United States, you always hear a lot of these stories, but seeing it within your own community is really what drove me to get involved within this cause. That's sort of my story. I'm sure Ollie has her own story that brought her into this organization itself. Yeah.
I was going to say, I think you hit the nail on the head about awareness. And, and one of the things that continues to inspire me in this job is hearing young people like Tasia and our other scouts talk about how they went ahead and they did their own research and they found causes that they cared about and they decided, okay, it's my time. What can I do? And they asked that question. I think that the more we can continue to raise awareness, I would hope that anybody who hears these stories will have the same reaction when they see the disparity, that they ask the question, what can I do? And I think that one thing that's wonderful about working for an organization like Touch Life, it's a outlet for individuals to ask that question and then act on it. So what can I do? I can create a fundraiser. I can create an awareness campaign. I can reach out to community partners that I see are doing the work, such as yourself, and figure out ways I can support those efforts. So I think a big thing for me was being able to be part of that kind of ecosystem of, I don't have the answers, but now I have a way to connect to the people who might have those answers and support them.
Thank y'all for sharing. I think whys are always really important and interesting to hear.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Dr. Powell, for taking your evening to spend with us and talk about a lot of these issues. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure anybody else who will be watching this or listening to this interview will learn a lot, both about Touch of Life and the McKinneyVento program.
That was great. Thank you so much to Dr. Powell and the administration at Eastside Union High School District for taking the time to work with us and talk to us about these impactful programs. And Tasia, one thing that I think it's important to reiterate from your discussion with Dr. Powell is the importance of knowledge in these situations and just raising awareness about the everyday struggles these students are facing.
Yeah, I think that's like one of the big key takeaways, and one of the reasons why we did this interview was so more people can understand how this program runs, and from someone like Dr. Powell, who has so much experience and knowledge within the program. And I think that also adds, joining volunteer causes like the Tall Scouts, which I encourage any youth or high schooler listening to this podcast to get involved with, which is one way to gain awareness, like Dr. Powell was talking about.
I think that it's important to remember that though we talked to one school, Eastside Union High School District is not alone in these struggles. We learned McKinneyVento is national programs. This is something that's happening across the country, and there are tons of ways to get involved in your own local community with your own schools. With that, Tasia, any final thoughts before we wrap it up?
No, really just want to reiterate, if you want to make a change, really gain awareness, join volunteer efforts like the Tall Scouts and really go out there and make an effort to just truly help someone who is in need and use the power of kindness that we're trying to get across in these podcasts. And once again, thank you for the whole Touch Your Life team for everything you guys have done and providing these platforms for both myself and people in need who need these resources. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you folks for listening. Don't forget, you can download the TAL Radio app available for Apple and Android devices to listen to all of our great and inspiring content. Some of Tasia's fellow scouts are actually working on some projects that will be available real soon. So keep an eye out for that. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, all at TAL Giving. That's TAL Giving. And learn more about the TAL Scouts, Touch Life Foundation. And if your school is interested in partnering with us to create a fundraiser on the TAL Giving platform, you can get in touch with us and learn more at touchalife.org. Again, that's touchalife.org. Thank you so much for listening.